So Ahab sent a message among all the sons of Israel and brought the prophets together at Mount Carmel. Elijah came near to all the people, and he said, "How long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him." But the people didn't answer him a word. And then Elijah said to the people, "I alone am left of the prophets of the Lord, but Baal's prophets are 450 men. Now, let them give us 2 oxen, and let them choose 1 ox for themselves, and cut it up and place it on the wood, but put no fire under it. And I will prepare the other ox, and lay it on the wood, and I will not put any fire under it. And then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God." And the people said, "That's a good idea." So Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose 1 ox for yourselves, and prepare it first, for you are many, and call on the name of your God, but put no fire under it." Then they took the ox which was given to them, and they prepared it, and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they leaped up on the altar which they had made. And it came about at noon that Elijah mocked them, and said, "Call out with a loud voice, for he is a god. Either he's occupied, or he's gone aside, or he's on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and needs to be awakened." And so they cried with a loud voice, and cut themselves according to their custom with swords and lances, until the blood gushed out on them. And then midday was past, and they raved until the time of the evening, when the evening sacrifice was taken. But there was no voice, and no one answered, and no one paid attention. And then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." So all the people came near to him, and he repaired the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. And Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord had come, saying, "Israel shall be your name." And so with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord, and he made a trench around the altar, large enough to hold 2 measures of seed. And then he arranged the wood, and he cut the ox in pieces and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 pitchers of water, and pour it on the burnt offering and on the wood." And he said, "Do it a second time." And they did. And he said, "Do it a third time." And they did it a third time. And the water flowed around the altar, and he also filled the trench with water. At the time of the evening sacrifice, Elijah the prophet came near and said, "O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant. And I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back again." And then the fire of the Lord fell, and consumed the burnt offering, and the wood, and the stone, and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." And then Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape." So they seized them. And Elijah brought them down to the brook of Kishon, and he slew them there. This too is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
I saw an interesting article on the Washington Times website this week. It was titled, "Who is Godless Now? The Russians Say It's the U.S." Now, this is an interesting idea because during the Cold War, the former Soviet Union and their allies were oftentimes referred to by Western European leaders and American leaders as godless communists. Now, first, the article points out some things that are just downright hypocritical on the part of the Russians, such as Russian President Vladimir Putin, a former KGB agent himself, making positive statements about traditional pro-family and other traditional values. Now, this is a recent development, according to the article, for Putin, and some of these analysts believe that it's a political move to help solidify his popularity among the people, because apparently in Russia there have been some protests against his administration recently. But some of the things that are mentioned in this article that some of the Russians are saying are shockingly true. The leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, criticizes laws in several European countries that prevent believers from displaying religious symbols such as crosses on their necklaces in the workplace in Western Europe. He said, the general political direction of the Western political elites bears without a doubt an anti-Christian character. He goes on to say, we in Russia have been through an epoch of atheism, and we know what it's like to live without God. And we want to shout to the entire world, stop. Historically, our own values in America are what have been termed Judeo-Christian values. And those values were reflected in our population, our government leaders, and even in our laws for the last 250, 300 years. Nobody really cared if a prayer was said before a football game or if the valedictorian said a prayer at commencement at a public high school. And historically, it's been understood that marriage is between a man and a woman. But as fewer and fewer people in our nation identify themselves as Christians, and as those who for years have told us that we should be tolerant are now proving that they themselves are the most intolerant, and as some of our national leaders believe that the best way to protect our country from terrorism is to embrace the Islamic values of Sharia law, as those things are occurring, we're finding that America as a nation and as a population is becoming less and less committed to Jesus Christ. Just as it was in Elijah's time, when the children of Israel had strayed away from God under the influence of the evil king Ahab and his crazy wife, Jezebel, and the prophets of Baal. God is calling people today, just as he was back in Elijah's time, to come back to him and worship him alone. Now, today we're going to take a look at one of God's messengers. We're going to start out by taking a look at Ahab's invitation. Then we're going to see Baal's failure. We find that that leads to Elijah's preparation, and that sets the stage for God's victory. Don't be indecisive. If the Lord is your God, serve him with all your heart. Now, this week's installment of the story is about God's messengers, the prophets. The role of the prophets in the nation of Israel was to proclaim God's truth to the king and to the people, who both had, in many cases, drifted away from God and were in desperate need of that truth. They needed to hear what God had to say. Occasionally, the prophets also predicted the future. Maybe they would predict something about Israel or Judah or one of the other nations around them, but the most significant predictions that the prophets made involved the predictions about the Messiah. They predicted that God would use the nation of Israel to be the way that he brought the Messiah into the world, to bring humanity back to God, to save us from our sins, and to give us an eternal relationship with God. And we find that that is where God's upper story connects with Israel's lower story in the story. Now, there were many prophets at this time: Elisha, Hosea, Amos. And if you haven't read this week's installment of the story, I would encourage you to do that. It talks about all these different prophets. It's quite interesting, and it's a very short read. But today we're going to concentrate on just one prophet, the prophet Elijah, and just one account from his life, his confrontation with the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. This account from Elijah's life starts with Ahab's invitation. Now, as we pick up the story in verse 20, Elijah has just told Ahab to gather all of the people and the prophets of Baal and the prophets of Ashtoreth, over 850 of them, to Mount Carmel. And so Ahab issues this invitation to the entire nation and to all of the prophets of these false gods. Ahab had complied. Now, Ahab, if you read back in some of the previous chapters of 1 Kings, had just tried to kill Elijah. So it's a bit strange that this same Ahab, who at one time is trying to kill Elijah, is now following his directions. And I think the reason for that is because deep down inside, Ahab was afraid of Elijah. He was scared. Because you see, through Elijah, God had threatened to stop the rain. This had caused a drought which had threatened the economy of the entire nation. It was a national disaster. And Ahab was afraid of Elijah. Furthermore, Ahab probably hoped that Elijah might, at this point, pray for rain, might use this spectacular gathering to lift the curse. Because you see, droughts were a pretty big deal back then. So the people of Israel and all of these prophets gather at Mount Carmel on the Mediterranean Sea, which is very close to the modern-day Israeli city of Haifa, close to Lebanon. And Elijah issues a challenge to the people in verse 21. He says, "If the Lord is God, then serve him. But if Baal is God, then serve him." You see, that's the problem the children of Israel had at this point. They couldn't make up their minds. They were indecisive. It kind of reminds me of people today. They want to see how far they can go with power or money or sex before they actually commit a sin. How much can they get away with during the week and still feel comfortable coming to a church like ours or Mount Auburn or Emmanuel on Sunday morning and sit in a pew and be comfortable? The people of Israel wanted to get as many benefits as they could from Baal and as much as they could from the Holy One of Israel. Because you see, they really weren't worshiping Baal and they really weren't worshiping God. What they were really worshiping was the idol of themselves. That was the true idol that they were worshiping. Now, in our New Testament reading in Romans chapter 11, it tells us that even though Israel had turned away from God, God did not reject Israel. He preserved his people, a righteous remnant, and his prophets to draw the nation back to himself. And the nation of Israel in Elijah's time is like many people today. They don't understand that a person is either for God or against him. Because you see, there's no middle ground with God, either then or now. He wants all of our worship, just as he did from the children of Israel back then. Well, since Elijah can't get an answer out of them, in verses 22 and 24, he says, okay, how about this? Since I'm the only prophet of God, and there's 450 prophets of Baal, let's have a duel of the gods. He says it'll look like this. The prophets of Baal can choose an ox for each of us, and then they can get a bunch of wood, and they put the ox on it for a sacrifice, but they don't put any fire under it. No, instead, you call on Baal, and I'll call on the Holy One of Israel. And whichever God sends fire down to consume the sacrifice, that is the true God. Now, I admit, this kind of sounds like a barbecue cook-off, doesn't it? I mean, which is better, Kansas City barbecue or North Carolina barbecue? Now, I'm sure that you all are going to go out to City Barbecue or Famous Dave's for lunch today after this sermon, right? Well, anyway, the people say, hey, this sounds like a good idea. And so now the stage is set for Baal's failure. So in verse 25, Elijah explains this challenge to the prophets of Baal, and they accept the challenge. And you may be wondering at this point, who was this false god, Baal? Well, Baal is a Hebrew noun that means master or possessor. Each village or region in Canaan or Phoenicia, which is now modern-day Lebanon, had their own local deity or master or possessor. So the term was kind of a generic general term used for God or gods. But in this particular passage, it probably refers to a god named Melkart, the god of Tyre, which is a city that was on the Lebanese coast of the Mediterranean Sea, just a few miles north of Mount Carmel, where this event's taking place. Now, you got to remember that at this time and in this culture, they didn't have a really strong system of what their gods were like the Israelites had. The Israelites had a very highly developed theology, if you will, based on the law of Moses. And as we have today. We have a very distinct set of ideas, set of things we believe, which we call the Reformed tradition, which is something that we highly value. But back then, the Canaanites didn't have anything like that. Furthermore, these false gods were empowered by demons. They possessed and oppressed these poor, misguided people at this time, just as false gods can do today. So, furthermore, Baal worship was a constant challenge to the nation of Israel all throughout the Old Testament. So they call out to Baal to answer them and to consume their sacrifice with fire. But there was no voice. No one answered. Nothing happened. So they leaped up on the altar and they started jumping up and down. Now, I thought about asking the choir to demonstrate that for you this morning, but then I thought with all the robes and everything, somebody would probably fall and get hurt, so probably not the best idea. Well, about this time, Elijah shows back up, and in verse 26, he mocks them. He heckles them. And in verse 27, he gives some biblical humor. And this is some of the most ancient trash talking that we find recorded anywhere in history. I mean, what these guys are doing today for the Super Bowl is nothing new, let me tell you. Elijah says, yell a little louder. After all, Baal's a god, right? Implying that maybe he was deaf. Then Elijah says, well, maybe he's occupied, which is sort of like saying, well, maybe he's gone on a journey, or he's taking a nap, or something like that. Then Elijah just right down insults them when he says, maybe he's turned aside. Now, that's an interesting phrase, turned aside. It probably means that Elijah was taunting them with what one scholar says that perhaps Elijah was suggesting that Baal had gone to the celestial men's room, that maybe he had to go potty, and when he was done, he'd get back to him. Well, as you can imagine, this only got the prophets of Baal even more twirled up. And so now they start cutting themselves with swords and lances. And as the Bible says, the blood gushed out of them. It's a horrible scene. The scholars tell us that this wasn't just a special show that they put on for this showdown with Elijah, that this was something that they did rather frequently in their worship of these false gods. It's a horrible thing. So they behaved like this until the evening sacrifice. But again, no God answered. No one paid attention. There was no voice from heaven and no fire. Don't be indecisive. If the Lord is your God, serve him with all your heart. So now this leads us to Elijah's preparation. Now it's Elijah's turn. In his book, Elijah, Chuck Swindoll draws several parallels between Elijah and a very humble hero named Thomas Wade Landry. He was a guy that had a lot to be proud of. He apparently was a B-17 pilot in World War II. And you know him as Tom Landry, the great coach of the Dallas Cowboys, who for over 29 years coached the Dallas Cowboys and took them to several Super Bowls. But there's more to him, because for 23 years he was on the board of directors of the Dallas Theological Seminary. And Swindoll describes him as a humble and wise man who was a very mature Christian. He was a person who put his complete trust in God, just as Elijah did. And on this Super Bowl Sunday, it's good to remember that great example of Tom Landry, which is also reflected in the prophet Elijah. Well, first Elijah says to the people in verse 30, "Come near to me." You see, the goal of this encounter for God was to turn the hearts of the people back to himself. He wanted the people to come near and worship him and him alone. He wanted them to be a part of this victory so that he could bless them. And he wanted the nation of Israel to worship the Holy One of Israel and him alone. So Elijah repairs the altar of the Lord, which had been torn down. He takes 12 stones, one for each tribe of Israel, each son of Jacob, and he builds an altar to the Lord. Now, Mount Carmel was probably an ancient site of the worship of the one true God. But when the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem was built, all of the worship of God was supposed to go there. And so this site probably deteriorated. But it was also probably taken over by Baal worship. And so the site had been a place of worshiping one god or another for a very long time. Well, Elijah had to build a new altar because he couldn't allow the Holy One of Israel to be worshipped on the same altar that this detestable god Baal had been worshipped upon. However, God himself is calling Elijah to make this sacrifice, to engage in this duel of divinity here. The next thing Elijah does is he digs a trench around the altar, and then he arranges the wood for the sacrifice. And then he says, get 4 pitchers of water and fill them up and pour them on the altar. Now you got to understand, this wasn't a pitcher like this one, or like your server is going to bring you water in when you go to City Barbecue or Famous Dave's for lunch today. No. It was a jar, probably about the size of our baptismal font, that would have held several gallons of water. And what he asked them to do was to basically go down to the Mediterranean Sea and fill these things with water. Because remember, there's a drought. They're not going to use fresh water. And so they drenched the altar with water, not once, not twice, but 3 times. The other thing that Elijah wanted to prove was that there wasn't some hidden fire underneath his wood, or that the wood hadn't been soaked in oil to make it burn better, so that there would be no possible accusation that he's faking it, no scandal involved here. And so now things are pretty much ready for God's victory. In verse 36, it tells us that it's the time of the evening sacrifice. And Elijah came near to the people who were assembled there, and he says, O Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that you are the God of Israel, and that I have done these things because you have commanded. Answer me, O God, so that these people may know that you alone are God in Israel, and that their hearts might be turned back to you. So now we see why Elijah did everything he did, and why he said everything he said in exactly the way he did it himself. Jealous of their worship, and he wants them back. And in verse 38, it tells us that a very dramatic thing happened. That fire from the Lord fell from heaven and consumed the sacrifice and the wood and the stone and the water and even the dust. God answered Elijah's prayer, which God had commanded him to pray. God defeated the Baal in 2 ways. God instructed Elijah to set up this contest. And then in the supernatural realm, God prevented these demons that empower these false gods from acting. And what's more, God himself acted to receive that sacrifice, consuming it in a flash, thus winning this, what you might call, duel of divinity, hands down. And verse 39 tells us that when the people saw this, they fell on their faces and they said, the Lord, he is God. And their hearts were turned back to the Lord that day. And for a time, a generation of the nation of Israel turned back to the Lord. And they served him and they worshiped him. And if you go on and read through 1 Kings, you'll see how some of those things occurred and what they were. And then in verse 40, it tells us that Elijah tells the people to seize the prophets of Baal. And they did. He took them down to the mountain to the north of the river of Kishon, and there he ordered the prophets of Baal to be executed. A bit harsh for our day and age, but at this time in the plan of God, it was essential that this sort of deadly, cancerous threat to the spiritual health of the nation of Israel be removed. And God did this because he is holy. And as our Reformed tradition teaches us, he is also sovereign, meaning God is in charge. God has a plan, and God's plan is contained in his story. So, therefore, it was necessary for the nation of Israel to remain obedient to God, that there be a righteous remnant, if you will, to allow Jesus the Messiah to be born from the nation of Israel. Now, in our community today, I don't think that most people worship idols made of stone or wood. Most of our neighbors don't worship false gods that are empowered by demons. But there are idols out there that tempt us to worship them all the same. Idols such as leisure, or entertainment. Not bad in and of themselves, no. But these things become idols when we order our lives around them. When we take our time, our effort, our energy, and our money, and we make those things the priority for those resources in our lives. One of the resources that we received from the people who published the story is a book called The Heart of the Story. And it points out that one of the most popular shows over the last few years, in one of the most popular modes of entertainment, television, is a show called American Idol. How ironic. I think at this point, we have to ask ourselves a question. Am I like the children of Israel in Elijah's time? Have I turned away from God in some or all of my life? Have I allowed something to take God's rightful place in my heart? Have I worshiped anything besides God, like money or cars or entertainment or leisure? I want you to know today that God is right there waiting for us to turn back to Him and worship Him alone, to put Him back at the center of our hearts and not those things that clutter our lives and clamor for our worship. He loves us so much that He didn't offer a cow and a bunch of wood as a sacrifice for us. He gave His only Son, Jesus Christ, to show us how much He loves us. And today, just like then, He is still only a prayer away. Don't be indecisive. If the Lord is God, worship Him and Him alone. Would you join me in prayer?